There is a dramatic moment at the start of the Seder when the leader holds up the matzah, which has just been revealed for the first time in the year, and says, Halachma anya, this is the bread of poverty, or the bread of affliction. Our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come eat. Let all who are in need come and share our Passover. This year here, next year in Israel, this year oppressed, next year free. Well, that's the translation in our Haggadah, Ledor Vador, B'chol Dor Vador, but actually in the original Aramaic, it's not this year oppressed, but Hashata Avdei, this year slaves. It's actually bizarre. What on earth is going on that we could sit round our tables at this dramatic moment, celebrating our freedom, and say we're still slaves? How on earth can this strange line in the Haggadah be explained? I think there are actually three possible explanations, and one of them is actually given in the Haggadah. The symbols on the Seder table, including the matzah, are to remind us that there is still oppression and slavery in our world. In other words, we can't really be free while there are others who are suffering. Nobody is really free until everyone is free. Looking at this way, we join together to hope for a better future. The second explanation is that what we are doing when the leader recites this passage is a kind of reenactment of what happened in Egypt. As the Haggadah says, our story begins in shame but ends in praise. And indeed, the words from which our Haggadah gets its title, B'chol Dor Vador, in each generation we should all imagine that we ourselves came out of Egypt. So when we see that matzah for the first time, we think of ourselves as back there with our roast lamb and bitter herbs, and that's why we say we're still slaves, because we're embodying ourselves in the drama. Just like that Torah reading, we're in two times at once as we sit at the Seder. The third explanation, which is one I find particularly interesting, is to say that there are many things in the Haggadah which were written at different times in our history, which were times of persecution. I once wrote a brief history of the Haggadah, showing how it has been shaped and grown over many hundreds of years. And thinking about the paragraph, Halachma anya, the bread of poverty, I speculated that originally it didn't have the first sentence attached to it. In other words, it just was an invitation to come and eat, saying that we are still slaves and hoping that next year we will be in the land of Israel. But at some point, I think somebody added a line on the top, an introduction saying, this is the bread our ancestors ate in Egypt. And when you add that introduction, it actually changes the meaning of the whole thing, because what follows is then no longer about Egypt, but about us. This is the bread they ate back then. So then, when we say we are slaves, it's saying we are slaves now. I think this tells us that this was written, or put together at least with the first line, at a time of persecution and exile. Exile because it says this year here, next year in Israel. Persecution because it says we're still slaves. The people around the Seder table are there yes, to recognize the oppression of others, but also our own oppression. And that explains why the Seder has been such a powerful moment through centuries of persecution. Even in the camps, at the darkest times of our history, it's provided hope, and every time we recite the Haggadah, it still speaks to us with that same power. This very day marks the 80th anniversary of the start of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In 1939, the Nazis collected 300,000 Jews into a tiny area in central Warsaw. And that overcrowding was only eased in a very tragic way as Jews were deported east to labor camps. By the end of 1942, it was clear to those who remained in the ghetto that these were not just labor camps, they were death camps. So when the Germans came in forcibly into the ghetto, as Passover started in 1943, they decided to resist. It was the largest Jewish resistance to the Nazis, and they managed, amazingly, to fight for a whole month. Around 15,000 Jews died in the fighting, and the remaining 50,000 who were there were deported to Treblinka and Majdanek. At Passover in 1943, the angel of death did not pass over the Jews of Warsaw, and nobody came to their rescue. In a powerful interview, Roma Frey, who survived it, was asked what it felt like to have the Seder there inside the ghetto in a bunker. That was so sad, she said. We tried to acknowledge to ourselves and to God that we're still Jewish and we want to keep the tradition. But what we felt in our hearts, I doubt if I can describe it. It was so sad, so tragic, the circumstances. We remembered our forefathers and all these hard times, the slavery and out of slavery, and here we hardly had a cop to survive, day or night or anything at all. We tried to have the candles on the table and a white tablecloth. It was a table with boards under, the way we had to do things, and with candles and the benches, and all this to be able to live on somehow, to survive somehow. 80 years ago in Warsaw, they must have said with real conviction, this year, slaves, next year, free. But sadly, very, very few of them actually survived. In recent years, there's been growing interest in Britain's own legacy of slavery. A seminal moment happened in Bristol on 7th of June 2020 when the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was toppled into Bristol Harbour by protesters. How could people reconcile Colston's generosity to the city of Bristol with the way in which he'd made his money? At the time, the Guardian newspaper had very full reports about the events in Bristol, and then they realized that they needed to have a look at their own origins. What they have now found out is quite shocking. Through painstaking archive work, the researchers they took on have discovered that the 11 founders who put up the money for the original Manchester Guardian newspaper in 1841, I think it was, had earned their money in the cotton trade, the industry on which modern Manchester was founded, and they imported their cotton from slave-owning plantations. The researchers even uncovered the names of a few of the slaves who harvested the finest Sea Island cotton. After the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, British plantation owners were granted huge compensation for the injury of having their property, i.e. enslaved people, taken from them. The slaves got their freedom, but no compensation or back wages at all. Now the Guardian has set up a fund which plans to invest around 10 million to help descendant communities linked to the newspaper's founders in the spirit of restorative justice. Such investigations and righting the wrongs of the past are truly important, but they should not allow us to distract our attention from modern slavery and the 50 million people in our world who are either trafficked or held against their will or forced to labor for almost nothing or in other ways enslaved. All of us probably own clothes and other articles which would shock us if we knew how little those who made them were paid for their time and trouble. We've just heard from the prophet Isaiah of the destruction of the Babylonians. Liberation, whether from Egypt or later from Babylon, came at a price. Just as then, so now, slavery cannot be ended without a struggle. So let me paraphrase as I conclude that paragraph from the Seder with which I began. This is the bread of affliction, the bread of the poor our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. All who are hungry, let them come and eat and share in what we have in our Passover meal. This year many are still slaves. Next year may they be free. This year we are here. Next year may we be in Jerusalem, a Jerusalem for all peoples, a city of peace and joy. Chag Sameach.